In the early 1980s, a technical change was made to the composition of everyday food. It entered the market as a simple improvement. The effects of this reformulation took years to become visible. This was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern. The shift didn't begin with a single decision. It accumulated through studies, recommendations, expert panels, and eventually policy. By the time the average person saw it reflected on a nutrition label, the conclusion had already been reached. Dietary fat, particularly saturated fat, was linked to heart disease. The solution seemed obvious: reduce fat, especially from animal sources, and replace it with something else. That something else was often carbohydrates. Not whole grains or vegetables in most cases, but refined carbohydrates, sugars, starches that could be processed, packaged, and distributed at scale. The food industry adapted quickly. Products labeled low-fat and fat-free began appearing on shelves. They were marketed as healthier, safer, the responsible choice. Most people didn't question it. Why would they? The guidance came from trusted institutions. The American Heart Association supported it. Government dietary guidelines reflected it. Doctors repeated it. If you wanted to avoid heart disease, you reduced fat. It became common sense. What made this shift so effective was how thoroughly it embedded itself into daily life. It wasn't just about individual products. It reshaped entire categories. Yogurt became fat-free and loaded with sugar. Salad dressings went low-fat and added stabilizers. Snack foods proudly displayed their reduced fat content, even as their ingredient lists grew longer and less recognizable. The change was everywhere, and because it was everywhere, it felt inevitable, normal. Children growing up in this era were taught these principles in school. Nutrition education emphasized the food pyramid, with fats pushed to the smallest section at the top. Bread, pasta, rice, these formed the base. The message was clear and repetitive. Carbohydrates were safe, fat was dangerous. For a generation, this wasn't controversial. It was just what you were taught. Most people never noticed this at the time. The transition felt gradual enough to be invisible. You didn't wake up one day and realize the food supply had fundamentally changed. It happened in increments. A reformulated recipe here, a new product line there, ingredients lists that slowly grew more complex. The food looked similar, it was sold in the same aisles, but what it was made of and how it affected the body was different. There was no public reckoning with this shift while it was happening. No widespread conversation about whether removing fat and adding sugar might create its own set of problems. The focus remained narrow: reduce dietary fat, reduce cholesterol, reduce heart disease risk. That was the equation. And because it was repeated so often by so many credible voices, questioning it felt almost irresponsible. The real impact appeared years later. Not immediately, not obviously, but in patterns that took time to recognize. Obesity rates began to climb in the 1980s and continued upward through the 1990s and 2000s. Type 2 diabetes, once rare in children, became increasingly common. Metabolic disorders that had been relatively uncommon started appearing with greater frequency across populations. These were not sudden events. They were slow accumulations, trends that only became visible in retrospect. By the time the consequences were visible, the habits were already set. An entire food system had been built around the low-fat paradigm. Supply chains, manufacturing processes, marketing strategies, all optimized for a model that prioritized fat reduction above other considerations. Changing course would have meant acknowledging that the guidance had been incomplete, possibly wrong. It would have required dismantling systems that had become deeply entrenched. The public health establishment did not pivot quickly. There was resistance to the idea that dietary fat might not be the primary villain. Researchers who questioned the low-fat hypothesis faced skepticism, even hostility. The narrative had been so firmly established that challenging it felt like challenging decades of scientific consensus. And so the guidance largely remained in place even as evidence began suggesting that the relationship between dietary fat and heart disease was more complicated than originally believed. What became clear, slowly, was that removing fat from food created other problems. Fat provides satiety. It signals to the body that you've eaten something substantial. When you remove it, people often feel less satisfied and eat more. The carbohydrates that replaced fat, especially refined ones, caused rapid spikes in blood sugar, followed by crashes that triggered hunger again. This cycle, eating, spiking, crashing, eating again, became normalized. It was how many people experienced food, without realizing it was a relatively recent phenomenon. The industrial food system adapted to these patterns. Products were engineered to be more palatable, more convenient, more shelf-stable. They were designed to fit modern lifestyles, quick, easy, requiring minimal preparation. But they were also designed to maximize consumption, to be hard to stop eating, to create cravings that felt natural but were carefully constructed. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices made by food scientists, marketers, and executives optimizing for profit. None of this was hidden exactly. The information was available. Ingredient lists were printed on packages. Nutrition labels showed sugar content. But the context was missing. Most people didn't have the background to understand what those ingredients meant, how they interacted with metabolism, why the proportions mattered. They trusted that if something was sold in a grocery store, if it carried health claims on the label, it was probably fine. That trust was systematically exploited. The system that created this situation wasn't designed with malice. It was designed for efficiency, for scale, for profit. Those are the incentives that drive industrial food production. Nutritional outcomes, long-term health consequences, these were secondary considerations at best. Not because anyone wanted people to be sick, but because the system wasn't structured to prioritize those outcomes. It was structured to produce food cheaply, distribute it widely, and sell it effectively. Individual choices existed within this system, but the system shaped those choices. You could try to eat differently, but doing so required time, money, knowledge, and access that many people didn't have. The healthy options were often more expensive, less convenient, harder to find. The unhealthy options were cheap, ubiquitous, heavily marketed. Blaming individuals for navigating this landscape poorly misses the point. The landscape itself was the problem. By the 2000s, some researchers began pushing back more forcefully against the low-fat paradigm. Studies showed that not all fats were equal, that some, like those from fish, nuts, olive oil, were actually protective. Other studies suggested that refined carbohydrates and added sugars posed significant metabolic risks. The picture that emerged was more nuanced than the simple fat bad, carbs good message that had dominated for decades. But changing public understanding is slow. The old message had been repeated so many times that it became embedded in cultural knowledge. Even as the science evolved, the popular wisdom lagged behind. People still bought low-fat products assuming they were healthier, still avoided butter and eggs while consuming processed foods laden with sugar. The gap between what experts were learning and what the public believed remained wide. The consequences of this gap continued to accumulate. Metabolic diseases kept rising. Healthcare costs associated with diet-related conditions grew. Communities with the least access to fresh, whole foods experienced the worst outcomes. The burden fell disproportionately on those who were already disadvantaged, creating health disparities that mirrored economic ones. None of this needed to happen, or at least it didn't need to happen this way. There were points where different decisions could have been made, where the precautionary principle might have been applied, where the focus could have been on food quality rather than just fat reduction, where the voices raising concerns could have been heard sooner. But those moments passed, and the system continued on its trajectory. What's remarkable, looking back, is how thoroughly the narrative was accepted. How little public resistance there was to fundamentally altering the food supply. How quickly the changes normalized. Part of that was trust. Trust in institutions, in expertise, in the idea that someone was watching out for public health. Part of it was simply how gradually the changes happened. They were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, and most people weren't. The people making these decisions, the policymakers, the scientists, the industry executives, weren't acting in bad faith for the most part. They were working within a system that had particular constraints, particular incentives, particular blind spots. They were responding to the evidence as they understood it, making recommendations that seemed reasonable at the time. But the system itself had flaws. It moved too quickly in some ways, too slowly in others. It was too confident in incomplete data, too resistant to correction, too influenced by commercial interests. And this wasn't the only change. Similar patterns played out across multiple domains of food production and nutrition policy. The same dynamics, initial recommendation, rapid adoption, industrial optimization, slow recognition of unintended consequences repeated themselves. Each time, the public trusted that the system was working properly. Each time, the full picture only emerged later. Each time, by the time people understood what had happened, the infrastructure was already in place and difficult to reverse.